SEC fans, Week 11, Auburn and Georgia is what we're going to talk about. We're having some weird audio issues this week, but hang with us. We got some good stuff to talk about. It's worth fighting through, I promise. Auburn and Georgia, this is a game we circled weeks ago. Auburn stubbed their toe against LSU, but they've come back really nicely, kind of rounding out that offense. And we wanted to see Georgia, because the SEC is so down this year, and across the board, college football is so down this year. We've really been desperate to see Georgia against a good defense and a team that can throw the ball, run the ball, sort of a rounded out opponent. We've got that in Auburn, Georgia. Vegas thinks this game is going to be close. I think Georgia opened a 2.5-point favorite. So we're going to talk about it. Obviously, we're going to run our computer model and see how these teams match up. But first things first, I want to talk about Auburn. We've just talked ad nauseum about Georgia this year, and I want to talk about them in South Carolina in a little bit. But first, let's get into this Auburn and Texas A&M game. Started out a little rough for Auburn, finished out with a pretty nice, clean, big number. So talk about what you saw in that game and what you've seen in Auburn since the LSU game. And the big question I have for you is, has Auburn found something offensively that should really worry Georgia? Or has Auburn's offensive success kind of been reflective of the competition they faced since LSU?
I think Auburn is improving offensively, genuinely. And I think Auburn is, frankly, a little overrated sometimes as a run offense, because of the style of offense they run, where Malzahn does that horizontal spread stuff, and they run in the same issue that Ohio State runs into, where they play a good team and they struggle. But that's more than counterbalanced by the fact that Auburn has found a passing game. Stidham struggled in the Clemson game when Auburn's offensive line, that probably didn't have an optimal lineup and was really trying to gel, just got whipped by probably the most disruptive front four in college football right now. But outside that game, he's been outstanding, and if not spectacular. We've talked ad nauseum on this channel about how the Mercer game, from a predictive standpoint, was actually an excellent game. It was 9.8 yards per attempt in that game. Stidham was 10.4 against Missouri, 15.7 against Mississippi State, 11.2 against Ole Miss. He struggled in that LSU game, but still 6.3 yards per attempt was solid. And, put that in perspective, it's probably similar to what Hurts' average was, I think, the entirety of last year. And they've rebounded the last 2 weeks, 9.5 yards per attempt against Arkansas, 9.9 yards per attempt again against Texas A&M. I feel like their run game is what it is. I think it's good. I don't think it's unstoppably good. And for the most part, they have to be kind of willing to understand that they need a balanced offense to be successful. I think they've come around to the fact that Kerryon Johnson is the best running back on the roster. I know both of us are sort of in the same camp, that we both think Cameron Petway is a good player. Something we've talked about mentioning in the past, but really haven't brought it up. Cameron Petway would probably be better utilized in this offense as an H-back, because I don't think they're getting great fullback play out of Cox at times. But when they try to be a traditional run team and a traditional sort of play action pass team, I think they're really good. And I think Johnson is good enough that teams can load the box and they can still move the chain somewhat, but that Stidham is absolutely good enough that when teams are committed to the run and they do catch them out of position, they can be successful. And we talked about this a lot in the A&M game, that Auburn hadn't done a very good job recently of being unpredictable, not only with the fact that, they run 17 times in a row on first down against LSU, but also that in that same game, they were in that same stretch. I think it was 14 of 18 second and third downs were passes or a run by Stidham. And so they didn't mix run or pass second or third down or first down. They passed on every obvious passing situation, ran on every obvious run situation. And when they're in more comfortable and they mix things up better, they do a better job. Now, all that said, I still think it's a bit of an open question whether they're going to be willing to play that the way they should against a good team, because the problem has been, really dating back for the past few years, every time they get into one of these games, they lose the creativity that you need to be successful. And I'm not talking about trick plays because those really aren't creative. They're low probability shots. I'm talking about creative in terms of it's 3rd and 9 and you call a halfback draw, or it's, 2nd and 1 and you throw a play action deep bomb. They don't do that with nearly enough frequency. And I think the offense really hasn't had any issues all year outside that problem. And if they get that fixed, if they can make Georgia have to play them straight up on both sides of the ball, no matter the down and distance, they are a very good offensive football team and more than capable of scoring points.
It's interesting you mentioned Cameron Petway, and obviously he's probably still out for this game with that shoulder, but I've noticed this year, and I don't know why, for whatever reason, but Cam Martin hasn't been getting a lot of carries, and they've been leaning so much on Kerryon Johnson, who's also been hobbled this year and had injury issues in the past. Is there some concern there that, okay, you lose Cameron Petway, and what we said last week before we learned about the injury was getting him back is good, not that we think he's this great all-world tailback, but because he is experienced, legitimate depth. Is there concern where I think Kerryon Johnson had 34 touches last week between receptions and carries, that you've got all your money on this one horse and you're not spreading the carries around and it's going to catch up to him at some point?
Well, we've seen it in the past. It kind of happened to them last year, and they've made it work before. Trey Mason kind of got overload carries at the end of that 2013 season, and he made it. The problem is Kerryon Johnson has a significant injury history, and you have to expect that if you give him this amount of touches, he's going to get hurt again. Cam Martin, I think, has a lot of talent. I don't think he's physically quite there yet. He's not big enough. And even if he can go in a game, accepting the fact that I don't know that he's necessarily going to be physical enough to run between the tackles against an elite team, I kind of question with his frame how durable he would be. So I do think there's serious concerns with depth at the running back position for them. I don't know how you can avoid it because at some level you've got to run your tailbacks, and they ran almost 80 plays against Texas A&M. They ran 79 plays. We've complained in the past that they don't really always get enough touches sometimes for the tailbacks. They fixed that problem in this game. Kerryon Johnson had 29 touches, all carries. Stidham had 27 pass attempts and 7 rush attempts for 34. So Johnson got almost as many touches as Stidham had. Especially when you consider the fact that it was 34 combining receiving, then it was perfectly balanced, right? Johnson had as many carries and receptions as Stidham had rushes and passes. But I don't know that you want that in one player. You'd like to see that in two backs. Even in a primary backup sense, you'd like to split that maybe 2-1. I think it's a concern, but it's one of those concerns where you say doing this every game isn't going to get you beat. That's just an added probability of something going wrong, in the same way that Sean White taking hits was a probability, or this season.
You just gave every Auburn fan listening PTSD, so you just had to do this.
Well, it was worse too. I was going to mention DeAndre Francois. We came out of last year and he took hit after hit. Those hits, every one of those hits, maybe they affect him to some degree, but that wasn't going to cripple them statistically up until the point where he gets hurt, in which case it would. And I know I have a bit of a reputation, I think, for being kind of a negative Nancy. It's probably very much deserved, but to me, that's what Kerryon Johnson is. I think as long as he stays healthy, there may be some ill effects and he may get banged up, but he's still going to be pretty darn effective. The problem is the moment he gets hurt, if Cameron Petway isn't back and Cam Martin becomes the primary tailback, it's going to have a really, really significant impact on this offense. So I don't think you can depend on it, and you want to cross your fingers, but much like Alabama's linebacker situation, where they're at the point now where one more middle linebacker going out and their defense is probably crippled. Auburn is that same boat, I think, in terms of running backs. And honestly, I think it's kind of amazing they don't have more running back depth at Auburn with their history for tailbacks, but it is what it is. And, you just kind of have to deal with it the way you can.
So we've seen Auburn's offense clicking post LSU I wonder now, though, we're at this situation where Auburn's got noted offensive line struggles that haven't really reappeared lately. Like, they've been holding up pretty well. I think that is sort of a measure of who they've played, but they've held up pretty well. Now they're facing a significant pass rush and a significant athletic upgrade on the other side of the ball in the front seven. Are you worried at all there relative to the offensive line struggles we talked about early in the year? Or has that Auburn offensive line sort of gelled throughout the season to the point where it's not a big concern for you?
I mean, I think it is a concern. We talked about a lot before the Clemson game. Both of us flipped our picks in that game based off the fact that we felt like their tackles struggled way too much against Georgia Southern, even in a blowout, that they were getting pressure, and we felt like they were going to have some issues with Clemson. And I think that ended up being extremely true. Their front struggled a lot with LSU once they got settled, a lot like Alabama did last week. And I think a lot of it's a testament to LSU that they're not as bad as people think they are. And especially now that their front seven's gotten a lot healthier, they're a lot better than people think they are. Georgia's just as disruptive, if not more. And I think we've seen a lot from Stidham that indicates that he gets spooked. And he has some trouble when he gets pressured. There's a lot of Baylor in that kid still. And when he's in a tight situation, what we saw in the LSU game is he was real quick to pull the trigger on very low percentage deep throws. And he wasn't really willing to try to buy time and find the intermediate completion that he needed to move the sticks. That's not a good thing when you play really good defense. And I think that disruption will be a problem here. I don't know if he's improved or not. And we talk about this a lot. The issue of the SEC right now is there really isn't a lot of parity. And it makes it really hard to make judgments because we look at one or two games that were close against really good teams, and it's hard to say whether you had a bad game or whether that's a real trend because most of the games that most of the top teams, and when I say top teams at this point, it's really Alabama, Auburn, Georgia, probably LSU. Most of the games they play, the teams aren't good enough to even strain them, and you can't really get a whole lot that's meaningful out of it. I don't know how much we should take from Auburn's losses to Clemson and LSU and how much of it was things like play selection, because I think it was a major impact, and how much of that was dictated, though, by the fact that the offensive line was struggling or that Stidham had issues with pressure. And we'll learn more in this game, but that's not really, a consolation to a lot of people. But I do think that there's something to that. But the flip side, and we've talked about this before, we talked about it going into the South Carolina game, I don't know that Georgia's faced many teams that throw the ball particularly well. And something we flagged in the South Carolina game that Missouri accepted because Missouri was, especially when they played Georgia, was not in any way a competent offense or defense. South Carolina was actually, by a pretty good margin, the best passing game they've faced. They had some success. Auburn is a substantially better passing game than South Carolina was. So to the extent that we said South Carolina may give them some issue, I still think Georgia's secondary really hasn't been tested, and there is an opportunity there for Auburn's passing game to show up if Georgia has more deficiencies that have still been more or less hidden to date.
So one more thing on Auburn before we move on to Georgia. Defensively, I think they've been good. I don't know that they've been that elite unit that we want to see them kind of take that next step. But they bottled up Mon pretty well, and then they brought in Nick Starkel, which I think was kind of a curveball. I know they talked about Kevin Steele talked about how they prepared two separate game plans because they really had a feeling that Nick Starkel was going to come in the game. Mon was 1.5 yards per attempt, 5 of 11. Nick Starkel came in 8.4 yards per attempt, 184 yards. And Trey Williams went for over 100 yards in this game, 6.9 yards per carry. So how worried are we, if we're putting our Auburn hat on, how worried are we that okay, the offense has had some struggles, but defense has always been there for us, that there might be some weaknesses in the defense that are going to show up Saturday?
Well, we've seen it a little bit. We talked about the LSU game. They struggled at times dealing with some of LSU's players and jet sweeps and stuff. There's some signs that the athleticism isn't totally there. I think their secondary is still pretty darn good, and I think more importantly, they're very sound. They play with good technique. They're pretty physical. I think they're not necessarily elite athletes, and it's not an overly big criticism because very few corners are. They don't grow on trees. It just means that they're beatable. But I don't know that I'm super concerned because they were kind of in control of the game. You play a different style of defense. And A&M, when they pass well, are generally effective, can be effective against almost anybody. They did shut Mon down while he was in the game. We don't really know what Starkel would look like against most teams. He had some success against Mississippi State, where Mon didn't have any success. And it may turn out that they start playing Starkel and all of a sudden A&M's offense is a lot better than it has been. Certainly, having any ability to get Christian Kirk the football improves their offensive production substantially. I do think there's concern to some extent in, like you said, that maybe they're not an elite unit, but I still think they're a very good unit, and I'm not really worried about it per se. It's just an area that maybe is beatable, but that's kind of the standard you're held to when you're playing top 5 teams.
So on to Georgia. Coming into this week, we finally heard the national chatter ringing that you and I have been hammering for over a month, that yes, Georgia is killing people, but when are they going to let Jake Fromm throw the ball? And that's not saying he can't throw the ball. It's just you got to get him some meaningful reps, even if you know you're going to get a blowout. Well, they didn't get a blowout against South Carolina, which is something else we pegged in terms of how South Carolina can shorten a game on Georgia. I don't know that this was ever really in doubt. When South Carolina opens up the game starting at midfield and they don't get any points, you kind of know that it's going to be a long day for them. But we did see Fromm throw the ball really well, I think, in this game, at least especially early on. So how much did you see against South Carolina and Fromm that tells you, okay, he's legit, Georgia's offense is legit, and people need to be scared? Or did you see some other things that gave you concern? Tell me what you thought.
I thought Fromm did a very good job of what he was asked to do in that ball game. And I'm going to backtrack from some things we've said, in that we weren't really ever saying that Fromm was a terrible passer. We were really concerned because he had played 2 games where he'd thrown more than 15 passes, which is kind of incredible for a starting quarterback. One of them was Notre Dame, where he couldn't manage 5 yards an attempt. The other one was Missouri, where he did very well, but Missouri's defense right now probably would give up 12 yards per carry to a convent. So we didn't really know what to think of Fromm and how he would do when he was asked to do more. Here he was asked to do more. He threw 22 passes, and he was 16-22. That's an impressive mark. And I, a lot like you, found myself watching that game going, well, that was a good pass. Well, that was a good pass too. That was a really good throw there. There were a lot of slant routes and deep slants and intermediate throws that were accurate, that were well timed. I think he did a really good job. Now, again, though, it was limited what they asked him to do. He didn't throw really very often at all the ball more than about 15 yards downfield. They kept it to about 10 yards. They were conservative with it. They were still in control of this game really defensively. They knew that. I don't blame Fromm for any of that. It's not to say that Fromm's a bad quarterback. We are still looking from that top 5 team perspective to say, how is he going to do when he plays an elite defense? We're going to see that probably this week to a certain extent with Auburn. We're waffling on whether we think they're truly elite defensively by the national discussion, compared to the Clemsons and the Alabamas of the world. I think they're at least close and should be in the discussion. And that's a thing that Georgia hasn't faced outside Notre Dame, who's a very, very good football team, as it turns out. So, yeah, I do think Fromm showed out a little bit. I think he showed that he can play at a high level. I mean, that was the highest yard per attempt mark that anybody's had against South Carolina. But again, though, and this is the problem with parity in the conference, we've got so little data. When you look at South Carolina, we gave Georgia a hard time, and we did that to a certain extent because we were looking for a way that South Carolina had a chance to be in the game. I mean, the obvious answer was Georgia was going to run the football very successfully, and that's why we both said, my prediction last week was 34-14, Georgia over South Carolina. So 24-point win, and, not necessarily that far off from the sort of realm that we were in here. South Carolina had the same issue. They haven't been able to play a team that had a good passing offense, and you look through it. I mean, North Carolina State may be very good. That was a bizarre game, opening game of the year. Missouri had a decent mark. Louisiana Tech had 8.5 yards per attempt. That was the second best game they had, second best game anybody had against their passing attack behind Georgia. But if you look at the other teams they played, Texas A&M, no, they don't really, their passing game has been bizarrely anemic all year. Tennessee, they're terrible. Vanderbilt's terrible. Arkansas is terrible. Missouri early in the season, again, terrible. Kentucky, not a really good football team. So I can't tell you if having 8.9 yards per attempt against South Carolina is an achievement or not. Again, though, the problem is it's not Georgia's fault. And I think I'm glad that they finally let Fromm throw it, because my fear was they were going to get into the Auburn game and that was going to be the first time they ever asked him to throw 20 passes. And that's not a good thing. So at least he's been asked to do something. But still, from a predictive standpoint, it's really hard to project how Fromm's going to do when he plays one of the upper echelon defenses that they're going to face if they stay a top 10 ranked team for the rest of the season.
How confident are you? Because we've seen, and we'll see this when we run the computer model, we'll see what the numbers say in terms of opponent averages. But you and I both think Auburn's run defense is pretty dang good, run defense. How confident are you, based on what you've seen and the fact that you've noted that Auburn has some issues in the secondary that can be exposed, if Auburn is that first team that can shut down this Georgia rushing attack, is it going to completely cripple Georgia's offense, or are they going to be able to still move the ball?
I think if Auburn can shut down Georgia's run attack without overly committing to it, it's going to be really, really difficult for Georgia to move the football. Because I think Wims is a very good receiver. I think some of the supporting guys like Ridley or what have you are good, but I don't know that they have that elite guy. They don't have a Malcolm Mitchell on this football team. And as much as we talk about Fromm, our running point throughout the whole season is this is kind of the year of the receiver in the SEC. And the receiving core is kind of make or break for most teams. The lack of receivers at Arkansas, where they lost, I think it was all their top 5 receiving targets. Even before Austin Allen went down, Austin Allen was the top-rated passer last year, and he was garbage in his first several games this year. Austin Allen was the same player. It was the receivers that were gone. Auburn's struggles this year, in my opinion, have been largely due to the fact that the receiving core isn't good enough to get separation and to consistently make plays. It's made the quarterbacks look rough. Auburn has a good secondary, and Fromm can be a very good quarterback, but he's got to have open guys to throw to. So my concern is if Auburn can stop the run, can Georgia get the separation needed to be able to get the passing game going? And again, we haven't seen a ton of contested throws by Fromm down the field. If Auburn's able to keep their safeties back, is Fromm going to be able to throw, he can't throw 4-yard passes, I think, against Auburn and move the sticks. He's going to have to throw down the field, and he's going to have to stretch them vertically. Is he able to make the correct reads in those situations? Is he going to throw into double coverage? Because at times he's kind of gotten away with that a little bit. There have been a number of throws to the pylon that he's been very good at that they kind of look like back shoulder passes that Wims has gone and gotten. But frankly, they really weren't. They weren't greatly praised, and they had a touchdown like that in this past game. It's easy to look at that play, and it's a really good play by the receiver, but the truth is if the corner turns around, it's an interception. And to a certain extent, that's more about what the defense didn't do than what it is Georgia did do. Now, Fromm put the guy in a position to make a play, but I think Auburn's corners are going to be a lot more capable of making plays than those. And that has a really substantial impact in the game. You know, if that, let's say on that touchdown pass, this theoretical play, he turns around and intercepts it. All of a sudden, this is a 17-10 game. And this becomes a down to the wire game against South Carolina. That's going to be a real question mark for me. And I think Auburn is going to a certain extent be able to stop the run. And I think Georgia is going to have a lot of trouble trying to move the ball through the air with consistency. And it's going to make it a really difficult contest.
Because I think we're starting to talk about this Georgia team sort of framing it in the context of where Alabama's been in the last 10 years. I'm not sure. It's the same thing with Alabama. A lot of people say, okay, well, just stop Alabama's running game and then you can force Hurts, to be uncomfortable. I'm not sure anybody can stop this Georgia rushing attack. I just don't know. I think when we see it, great, but until it happens, I asked you that question because I think it's worth discussing, but I still don't know that it's going to happen in this game. Okay, so we know what we got with these two teams. I think the best thing we can do at this point is get into the numbers. So both Auburn and Georgia fans should be familiar with our computer model. No need to really explain what that is. I'd say let's just get into the numbers. Let's see what they say, and then we can talk about it.
So both these defenses are really darn good. It's the first point that's not surprising to anybody. Georgia is a little bit better statistically. Really against the rush, it's a wash. 73% of opponent averages by Auburn, 70% of opponent averages by Georgia. If you want to, you can chalk that almost to statistical error. I mean, 3.39 yard per carry allowed by Auburn, 3.26 by Georgia. Auburn's opponents are just slightly better than Georgia's. It's pretty much the same deal. The one place that's a little different, like we said, Auburn's secondary is very good at 81% of pass defenses allowed. That's very good. Really what I would consider sort of the great range. But you really have to be below 80% to be elite. Georgia has been at 75%, which is elite. The problem is there's a pretty significant difference in the quality of opponent pass offenses they've faced. Auburn's opponents average about 7.3 yards per attempt, and Georgia's opponents average about 6.8 yards per attempt. It's easy to look at that and feel like, well, that's just 0.5 yards per attempt. How much does that really matter in the grand scheme of things? Well, maybe not a ton, but again, perspective. You go from about 60th nationally for Auburn all the way down to about 99th for Georgia. It's a big drop. So to a certain extent, I think too, when you have a really good active front, when you play teams that are pretty darn bad in passing offense, you can really shut them down because you disrupt them too much and you get too much pressure, and that's usually a big reason why the passing offense struggles. And I don't know how much you're going to be able to generate against Auburn. So one of the keys that we already talked about is how much can Auburn slow down that disruption and how much does that affect them and cause their passing game to stutter. But regardless, if we just go with the current percentages and we assume they're correct, what does that look like for both teams? Well, first off, it means that Auburn's not going to run the ball terribly well at all. Their run game, even though it's pretty darn good, much like LSU, it's going to struggle, but Georgia's better than LSU. 3.6 yards per carry predicted. That's not enough to move the chains. They're going to have to rely on the pass. They're expected to have some success throwing the football, 6.6 yards per attempt, but that's enough to get a couple random scores or a couple random drives. That's not enough to consistently move it. Georgia, on the other hand, it's a lot of what you mentioned earlier. They averaging almost 6 yards per carry, and it's pretty crazy. Auburn's a very, very good run defense. But even with that considered, it's still saying that Georgia's going to get 4.3 yards per carry. That's not enough to run away with this ball game, but that's enough to keep the run game going. That 5.5 yard per carry difference between Auburn and Georgia is really the difference between being able to rely on the run as a balanced component to move the sticks, and Auburn using the run to keep the other team honest against the pass, because you can't move it with the sticks running the ball. Georgia is expected to get 7.2 yards per attempt, which is fair. But again, our model does take into account run-pass balance. So it's assuming that Georgia doesn't throw very often and get 7.2 yards per attempt. What's the score prediction that comes out to, which is what everybody's waiting on? Well, that's Georgia 27, Auburn 20. And again, perspective, Notre Dame put 19 on Georgia in a 2019 game. It's basically saying Auburn is offensively about what Notre Dame is. And Notre Dame's a very good offense. It's predicting a similar game against Georgia. We talked about right after that Notre Dame game, which was a close win, we both came out of that game and we said, wow, we felt like Georgia played a poor game and won, because we felt like their potential was crazy high, and we were very high on that football team early in the season. That's why I think you see Georgia predicted with 27. I think Auburn's defense, honestly, I don't know that there's a huge gap between them and Notre Dame. I don't know how much Notre Dame is a better or worse team, as controversially as I will say, than Auburn in an average sense. But I think Georgia's improved offensively. I think that's how you get 27. So basically what you're looking at from the model's perspective, 27-20, is something that's very similar to the Notre Dame game, where it's kind of ugly. Anything under the 30s in scoring means teams are really having to struggle a little bit to move the football, just like Georgia scoring 24 in the last game against South Carolina. You're not doing it every drive. But Georgia, according to the model, pulls it out by a touchdown.
So let's go ahead and answer that question. Is this the best team that Georgia's faced all year? And again, like you said, that's a controversial question considering where Notre Dame's ranked right now. But I guess answer two questions. Is this the best team that Georgia's played all year? And taking away the Georgia game, like take that off of Notre Dame's schedule, would Auburn be undefeated with Notre Dame's schedule?
First answer, I think I'm going to go with no. I think Notre Dame is a better team because I think Notre Dame's offense is a little more dynamic than Auburn's right now. It is way more run-based, but with a dual-threat quarterback, and when they want to pass, they have been able to pass successfully. So I think that's the first answer to your question. And then the second answer is, would Auburn be undefeated? Well, I'm going to throw out the Georgia Notre Dame game in that consideration. Okay. So we're going to say Georgia game accepted. Would they be undefeated with that schedule? Neither one of us ever bought into Southern Cal. I think Auburn wins that game. And it's not a knock on Auburn when I say to a large extent, because I don't think Southern Cal is very good, frankly. I'm not to say that that's close or that it has to be because Southern Cal is not very good. I just don't know that that would be a huge challenge, frankly, for Auburn. I think they would be able to stop them defensively, and I think they'd be able to run very successfully. I think you'd have a similarly brutal result. I think North Carolina State is the big one. Temple, Boston College, Michigan State, Miami, North Carolina, Wake Forest. I think they probably win all those games. And a lot of them they're going to win by double digits. But North Carolina State, with the disruptive players they have on the front four, would give Auburn a lot of issues. And Auburn's real issue right now is dealing with disruptive players. The model's giving them a little bit of credit in this game that Georgia isn't going to shut them down, but I think North Carolina State is the one game that, at the very least, I'd say is 50-50. And I don't know that North Carolina State is really a great overall team, so I think Auburn still wins. But I think, let's say a 60-40 chance of Auburn beating North Carolina State, or maybe in a 65-35% chance. If you have a 65% chance of winning one game, well, it doesn't, let's say there's only a 20% chance that you lose any of the remaining 7 games. That still means that you more likely than not are going to drop at least one. So I don't think they're undefeated, outside the Georgia game. I don't think they would be able to match Notre Dame's record, but I do think they would be within a game of their record. I think they'd probably be 70, let's say 60% chance that they would be 7-2 with Notre Dame's record, and about a 40% chance that they'd have the same record as Notre Dame.
Is this the best pass defense that Georgia will have faced all year? And is this the best pass offense that Georgia has faced all year?
I would say the answer to that is yes and no. This is a better pass defense than they faced all year. Notre Dame was close. Auburn is a tick better. They're more disruptive in the front, I think. I don't know that the secondaries are pretty similar in my view, the back seven, but Auburn's linemen are better than Notre Dame's, I think, by a little bit. However, when you say passing offense, it's kind of cheating because I think Missouri's passing offense is probably better. But it's a huge caveat. They have no balance. And Auburn has balance. So they're a lot more dangerous than Missouri. They're a lot more dangerous than Missouri because you can't just defend the pass and pin your ears back the way you can against Missouri right now. But if you turn about like potencies in a passing attack, probably, yeah. I mean, Notre Dame can't pass the ball particularly well. They're definitely a run-first team. The one area that I will mark is, and I think this is vital, Auburn is substantially the best rush defense that Georgia has faced. Notre Dame is a very good team. We're going to cover them in another video this week. But Notre Dame's rush defensive rating in terms of opponent percentages is 87%, which is very good, but it's not an elite rush defense. And they gave Georgia a lot of issues. Auburn is way better at 72%. If you want to look at it this way in terms of differential from opponent averages, in a manner of speaking, Auburn's rush defense is twice as good as Notre Dame's statistically. And considering that Georgia averaged, a respectable 4.3 yards per carry, I think it's quite conceivable that Auburn is going to handle Georgia to less than the also 4.3 yards per carry predicted by the model. And if that's the case, that could end up making this game a little bit closer.
So I'll give my prediction now. I think that Georgia is going to be a little shocked in this game in that things have been real easy for most of the year for them. Again, I think the South Carolina score and game for Georgia was very similar to the LSU game for Alabama, though probably not as physical in that, like we talked about in our Alabama-Mississippi State preview, that game wasn't ever really truly in doubt. So I think Georgia's going to find a little bit of shock there early and might take them a little while to hit their stride. I kind of like the 27 for Georgia. I think it's going to be closer than 27-20. Give me 27-24 Georgia. I wouldn't, and even though that's close, I would be surprised if Auburn won the game, just because I've seen Auburn struggle mightily with their wide receivers getting any kind of separation against a good secondary. I don't know how good Georgia's secondary is at this point. I don't think they're a bad secondary. So I think they're going to struggle a little bit there. But I also think that they have the ability to hit a deep shot here or there that's going to make this game super interesting. And what's funny is I'm not incredibly high on Auburn this year, and I think this is going to be a close game. But let's say Georgia does hit my score and wins 27-24. I still think they're a playoff contender, number one, number two type team in the country, even if this is a close game. Is that fair, or am I crazy?
I think it's completely fair. Auburn really is a defining characteristic. They are one of the best run defenses in the country, period. They are one of the best run defenses in the country. There are very few that are better. Maybe Alabama. Well, Alabama probably is better. And we say maybe because the linebacker situation makes that a bit more of a question mark. Clemson is probably better, and maybe Ohio State, maybe, though last week brings everything about them into doubt. Georgia's going to struggle with teams that can stop the run because they're such a run-first team. My opinion on this, like you said, we've seen Auburn throughout the season the model is pretty good about seeing where teams have uncharacteristic struggles when they play defenses beyond a certain threshold or have unpredictably high scoring offense when they exceed a certain point, where where teams either get shut out or blow out. It does a decent job of that. But I think Auburn's tendency this year even exceeds that, what the model would see. I don't think Auburn's going to be able to move the ball particularly well because, much like the Clemson game, Georgia is super disruptive. And I don't know that Stidham is going to be able to really cope with that. And that gives me tremendous pause. The problem is I haven't seen a lot from Georgia, or rather, I guess I haven't seen enough from Georgia that makes me buy that Georgia is going to be able to deal with Auburn's rush defense. I think this is going to be a really low-scoring game. My prediction, after a lot of waffling, is 17-9 Georgia over Auburn, where maybe Auburn doesn't score a touchdown. I think this could look a lot like the Clemson game. I think Auburn's going to be more successful than in that game, but I think, again, they may really struggle scoring touchdowns and have a couple big plays, maybe deep passing plays that are contested by Stidham. And we've talked about this a lot. Anytime the two of us see a game where scores are below 21 points, stuff gets weird because at that point, one kick return touchdown, and a great example of this is the Auburn LSU game. When you have a game like that is that low scoring, one punt return touchdown, one kick return touchdown, one inopportune fumble, scoop and score can make a team that, again, like North Carolina State, South Carolina, a team that is statistically should lose the game will win it because you don't have enough points to sort of regress to the mean. You don't have enough good possessions for the better team to show up. You're just not scoring points. And so random one-off plays end up mattering a lot more. They're the least predictable plays. So I think I'm going to go with a 17-9 prediction, but I do that with a warning that is, you said you'd be surprised if Auburn won the game. I'll be surprised if Auburn wins the game statistically. I won't necessarily be shocked if Auburn wins the game. And the reason for that is I think this is going to be an ugly game. And in these ugly games, anything can happen. The game is in Jordan-Hare. That's going to be a tough environment for the freshman quarterback. And I don't know. I mean, it's going to be a tough ball game. I think Georgia pulls it out. I have a lot of faith in them. It may be a coming out party for Georgia. But it's going to be interesting to me because as much as we talked about the Notre Dame game and a lot of other stuff, that's also Tennessee game aside because Tennessee is frankly a terrible football team. Vanderbilt's a terrible football game. That's the only tough road game that Fromm's played in was the Notre Dame game. And now all of a sudden he's got to go back into what is, in my opinion, a very hostile environment in Jordan-Hare. It's going to be a tough game, and any win that Georgia gets out of this should be looked at as a victory because it's going to be tough for them to pull out this W.
All right, so we've done this a few times this year. Let's do it again. If Auburn wins the game, give me your MVP. If Georgia wins the game, give me your MVP.
For me, in this game, for both teams, it's going to be the quarterbacks. I think if Auburn wins the game, Stidham is going to have to make a couple big plays with his arm, and he's going to have to do that so that he can really differentiate things enough, get a couple touchdown passes that puts them over the top because I don't think they're going to be able to run the ball with enough success. And the same thing's kind of true for Georgia. I think they're going to have to pass to move the ball consistently. I think it's very easy that one of the running backs could be the MVPs, but they're going to split. I think what you're going to see is that they're going to be fairly successful but not dominant. They're going to split a lot of carries between all the different backs, and Fromm is going to have to move the chains with his arm. What we've seen, especially last week, makes me think he can and will. But I think on their side, it's probably not going to be enough to necessarily be dominant. But I still think overall, Fromm is going to be the guy that scores a couple touchdowns because I think Auburn is going to load up against the run and try to make Fromm beat them.
All right. So if Auburn manages to win this game, obviously we know Georgia, if they win this game, they've already clinched the East. If they win this game, they're going to beat Georgia Tech. They could potentially lose to Alabama or Auburn in the SEC championship game and still make the playoff. So let's put that aside. We've already labeled them a championship playoff contender. So we've already been there. Let's go there with Auburn. If Auburn wins this game, how much of a material threat to the playoffs are they? Like, do you think that puts them sort of in the conversation?
That's a pretty good question. I mean, the playoff situation right now is really fluid. I think we've got a lot of one-loss teams you'd have to jump. I don't think you're going to get past Notre Dame. I mean, Notre Dame may have lost to Georgia, but they still only got one loss. They get probably a lot of undue hype. Wisconsin, again, if they go undefeated, it's going to be hard to keep them out. Same thing with Miami. But Clemson out there, I don't think you can get past. Oklahoma, I don't think you can get past if they have the same number of losses and win their conference championship. And, I think they're in the hunt. I think if they win this game and then beat Alabama, they're absolutely in the hunt because then they're going to go to the conference championship. And interestingly, probably have to play a rematch with Georgia, which I don't think I've heard enough chatter about the fact that that's a real possibility, that Auburn could beat Georgia and Alabama and more than likely would have to beat Georgia again. So I definitely think they're in the playoff discussion at that point, but I think the two losses that they've suffered makes it extremely hard. And if you want to talk about a probability angle, even if they win this game, they've still got to beat Alabama, and they probably still have to beat Georgia again. So I think it's still a serious long shot for Auburn to make the playoff. Is it possible? Yes, but I would say even if they beat Georgia, unfortunately, they're probably still looking at a 10% or less chance of actually being able to get in.
I think it would be interesting, though, for Auburn fans who have been pretty down on Gus this year, and I think he's caught some fair criticism this year. After all of this, with all the crap that has gone on this year, wouldn't it be interesting coming out of this game if Auburn was back in the discussion? Well, that's it for Auburn and Georgia, y'all. Like we've said, every week, give us your score predictions in the comments. Let us know what you think about this game. Give us your MVP for this game. And obviously, if you hate what we're saying, give us a thumbs down. But make sure you follow up with a comment. And again, man, thanks so much for giving us a listen. Have a great week, and God bless.